I spotted them from 3,000 feet on a clear October morning. Two massive upright canines moving through the dense Mississippi forest canopy with a coordination that made my hands tighten on the controls. The helicopter was doing routine power line inspection, something I had done hundreds of times before, when movement below caught my attention in a way that nothing else ever had. Both Dogman creatures were traveling parallel to each other, about 50 yards apart, their dark fur clearly visible against the autumn leaves. Their size was impossible to mistake even from altitude. They were not running on all fours like wolves or bears. They moved on two legs with a loping gait that covered ground faster than anything natural should move. The altitude gave me a perspective that ground observers never get. I could see how the Dogman pair maintained perfect spacing between them as they navigated through difficult terrain. When one slowed to navigate around a fallen tree, the other adjusted pace automatically. When dense undergrowth forced one to detour, the other shifted position to compensate. This was not coincidental parallel travel. This was coordinated movement with a purpose I could only guess at. I banked the helicopter for a better angle and grabbed my camera from the co-pilot seat. The Dogman pair seemed aware of my presence overhead but didn't stop their coordinated movement through the timber. I managed 3 photographs before they vanished into a ravine thick with old growth. My pulse hammered against my ribs. 20 years of flying over these forests and I had never seen anything remotely like this. The rest of that patrol route passed in a blur. I could not stop replaying those few seconds in my mind. When I landed back at the airport 2 hours later, I sat in the helicopter for 10 minutes trying to process what I had witnessed. My hands still shook slightly when I filled out the flight log. I wrote down the coordinates where I had seen the Dogman creatures but kept the entry vague. Unusual wildlife activity. Nothing that would raise questions or prompt official investigation. I needed time to think before deciding how to proceed. So before we go further, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. That sighting changed the trajectory of my life in ways I could not have predicted. I returned to the same area the next day and found tracks near the ravine where the Dogman pair had disappeared. The prints were unlike anything in the wildlife guides. 5 toes with claw marks extending well beyond the pad, pressed deep into soft earth. The stride length suggested something walking upright that stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. The tracks told a story if you knew how to read them. The weight distribution showed bipedal locomotion with occasional brief touches from knuckles or forelimbs during steep descents. The depth of the impressions indicated body mass far exceeding any known canine. The spacing between prints was consistent with an efficient walking gait, not the bound of a quadruped. These Dogman creatures moved like humans in terms of their locomotion mechanics, but with power that suggested something far stronger. I cast several of the clearest prints using plaster I bought from a hardware store. The process took hours because I wanted to preserve every detail. The dried casts showed anatomical features that were impossible to explain through conventional biology. The toe pads were elongated and flexible, designed for gripping. The heel structure showed weight-bearing adaptations similar to human feet, but scaled larger and reinforced. The Dogman foot was built for upright walking across varied terrain. My background is aviation, not wildlife biology. I flew search and rescue for 12 years before transitioning to commercial helicopter work. I know how to spot movement from altitude, how to distinguish animals from shadows, how weather and light can play tricks on perception. What I saw that morning was not a trick. The photographs proved that much. They were not clear enough for scientific analysis, but they showed dark shapes moving upright through terrain where no human should have been. The search and rescue experience taught me systematic investigation methods. When looking for lost hikers or downed aircraft, you grid search an area and document everything relevant. You follow logical patterns and eliminate possibilities methodically. I applied those same principles to understanding what I had witnessed. The Dogman sighting was the starting point. Everything else would be about building context and gathering supporting evidence. I started asking questions. Local hunters mentioned strange howls that did not match any known predator. Game cameras captured blurred shapes that suggested something large and bipedal moving at night. Livestock had gone missing from farms near the forest boundaries, with injuries that veterinarians could not fully explain. The patterns pointed to predators with intelligence beyond typical animal behavior. Most people dismissed the accounts as imagination or misidentification. I could not dismiss what I had witnessed from the air. One farmer showed me photographs of a calf that had been killed 3 months before my sighting. The injuries were strange. The animal had been taken down with what looked like precision rather than the chaotic violence of typical predation. No struggle marks in the surrounding soil. No defensive wounds on the calf beyond the killing strike to the neck. It suggested a predator that knew exactly what it was doing and executed with minimal waste of energy. A hunting outfitter described finding camps that had been investigated during the night. Gear moved but not stolen. Food examined but only certain items taken. Footprints around the perimeter that were too large to be human and too defined to be bear. The outfitter had stopped using certain areas because his clients refused to return after experiencing the feeling of being watched. The Dogman presence was affecting human activity patterns even without direct encounters. 3 weeks after the initial sighting, I contacted 2 forest rangers who had worked the Mississippi backcountry for decades. They had heard the rumors and seen evidence they could not officially report without risking their credibility. One had discovered territorial markings carved into trees at heights no bear could reach. The other had tracked what he believed were Dogman prints for miles before losing the trail at a creek. They agreed to meet with me on neutral ground, away from official channels. The meeting location was chosen carefully, a hunting cabin 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by logging roads that saw little traffic. We gathered on a Friday evening when all 3 of us could arrange time away from regular duties. The senior ranger arrived first, carrying a worn pack and several rolled maps. The younger ranger followed 20 minutes later, nervous but committed to hearing what I had to say. We gathered at a hunting cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. The senior ranger brought maps marked with locations where unusual incidents had occurred over 15 years. The pattern was clear when plotted together. A territory roughly 30 square miles with a core area deep in the most inaccessible part of the forest. The Dogman sightings clustered around this zone, always at dawn or dusk, always involving creatures moving with purpose rather than random wandering. The senior ranger shared his experiences first. He had been tracking unusual signs for over a decade, documenting patterns that did not fit established wildlife behavior. Broken branches at heights that suggested something very tall had passed through. Scratches on trees that showed 5 distinct claw marks rather than the 4 of a bear. Vocalizations recorded on his personal equipment that defied classification. He had kept quiet because reporting these findings would have ended his career. The younger ranger told us about an encounter from 2 years earlier. He had been conducting a backcountry patrol alone when he heard something large moving parallel to his trail. Every time he stopped, the movement stopped. When he continued, it resumed. This went on for over 3 miles before whatever was pacing him finally broke away. He found tracks later that measured 17 inches long with clear toe definition. The experience had shaken him badly enough that he avoided solo patrols in that area for months. I showed them my photographs from the helicopter sighting. The images were grainy and taken from distance, but they showed enough detail to be compelling. 2 dark figures moving upright through forest where no humans should have been. The rangers examined the photos carefully, passing them back and forth under lamplight. The senior ranger finally nodded and said what we were all thinking. This was evidence, flawed but real. Combined with what we each had experienced and documented, a picture was emerging. We spent that entire night comparing notes and mapping patterns. The core territory centered on a particularly remote section of national forest that saw minimal human activity. Hunters avoided it because game was scarce there, suggesting the presence of apex predators. Hikers found the terrain too difficult and the atmosphere unsettling. The few people who did venture into the core area rarely returned for repeat visits. The Dogman pair had effectively maintained an exclusion zone without any official designation. The younger ranger had researched historical accounts from the region. Native American tribes spoke of wolf spirits that walked like men and hunted in the deep places. European settlers documented similar legends when they arrived in the early 1800s. Church records mentioned creatures that the faithful claimed were demons or shapeshifters. The descriptions matched across centuries and cultures. Large canine features, bipedal locomotion, coordinated pack behavior, and intelligence that exceeded normal predators. We examined accounts from French explorers who passed through Mississippi in the 1700s. Their journals described attacks by wolfmen that killed livestock and terrified settlements. The explorers attempted hunts but never successfully tracked the creatures to their lairs. The attacks would continue for weeks, then cease completely for months or years. The pattern suggested intelligent predators that understood when to avoid human attention and when they could operate with relative freedom. The European werewolf legends offered additional context. Medieval accounts from France and Germany described creatures that hunted in pairs or small groups, used tools, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities. The transformation mythology was likely cultural interpretation of encounters with something that existed naturally. The Dogman concept fit these older stories better than modern cryptozoology typically acknowledged. We were not dealing with movie monsters. We were tracking predators that had adapted to remain hidden while living alongside human populations for centuries. The younger ranger had found references to werewolf trials in Germany during the 1500s, where defendants described creatures matching the Dogman characteristics exactly. The accused spoke of enormous wolves that walked upright, communicated with each other through howls, and showed cunning that exceeded normal animal intelligence. These testimonies were dismissed as fantasy by authorities focused on prosecuting supposed shapeshifters. But reading them with fresh perspective, they sounded like accurate descriptions of encounters with actual cryptid predators. We planned our investigation carefully. The helicopter gave me aerial reconnaissance capability that few researchers had access to. The rangers provided ground expertise and knowledge of terrain that could not be observed from above. We divided the territory into sectors and began systematic documentation. Every track, every marking, every broken branch that suggested something large had passed. The data accumulated slowly over months of careful fieldwork. The senior ranger established a baseline of normal wildlife activity in the study area. He documented bear movements, deer migration patterns, and predator populations. This baseline allowed us to identify anomalies that suggested Dogman presence. Areas where game was unusually scarce. Trails that animals avoided despite optimal conditions. Zones where traditional predator territories showed gaps that should not exist. The Dogman pair were creating measurable effects on the ecosystem around them. My aerial surveys revealed patterns invisible from ground level. The Dogman creatures appeared to use specific corridors for movement between different parts of their territory. These routes followed ridgelines and creek beds that provided both cover and efficient travel paths. From altitude, I could see how these corridors connected feeding areas, resting sites, and territorial boundaries. The land use showed planning and systematic exploitation of resources. We discovered that the Dogman pair operated on a regular schedule. Sightings clustered around dawn and dusk, suggesting crepuscular activity patterns similar to wolves. They avoided the brightest part of the day and the darkest hours of night, instead choosing times when light conditions favored their movement but limited visibility for potential observers. This behavior suggested they had adapted to living near human populations by minimizing exposure during periods when people were most active. The Dogman tracks appeared most frequently along ridgelines and near water sources. The prints averaged 16 inches long and showed clear distinctions from bear tracks. The toe arrangement and claw extension matched canine anatomy, but the heel structure indicated bipedal weight distribution. We found tracks at multiple elevations, suggesting the Dogman creatures were comfortable in varied terrain and used the landscape strategically. One particularly productive area yielded tracks from multiple visits spanning several weeks. The prints showed the Dogman pair returning to the same location repeatedly, suggesting it served an important function in their territory. We eventually determined this was a feeding site where they brought prey for consumption. Bones scattered in the underbrush confirmed regular use. The variety of species represented indicated these Dogman creatures were opportunistic predators, taking whatever prey was available. Tree markings revealed territorial behavior more complex than typical animal scratching. Deep gouges arranged in patterns appeared on mature trees throughout the core territory. The marks occurred at heights between 7 and 9 feet, well above what bears typically reach. Some trees showed signs of repeated marking over years, with older scars healed into thick ridges. The Dogman pair I had observed were likely maintaining boundaries established long before my sighting. The tree markings showed sophistication beyond simple territorial scratching. Some patterns appeared to encode information about the area, perhaps serving as trail markers or boundary indicators. The spacing between marked trees was remarkably consistent, suggesting deliberate placement. We photographed over 200 marked trees and mapped their locations. The resulting pattern revealed a network that outlined the core territory with precision that implied planning and maintenance over extended time periods. We analyzed the claw marks in detail. Each Dogman had left distinctive patterns based on slight variations in claw length and spacing. This allowed us to determine that at least 2 individuals were actively maintaining the territory, confirming the pair I had observed from the helicopter. The marks appeared freshest during spring and fall, suggesting seasonal behavior cycles that might relate to resource availability or reproductive patterns. We set up trail cameras at strategic locations throughout the territory. Most captured nothing more interesting than deer and raccoons. 3 cameras positioned near water sources caught something different: dark shapes moving upright through the frame, visible for only seconds before disappearing into shadows. The Dogman figures moved with a fluidity that seemed almost deliberate, as if aware of the cameras and choosing to reveal themselves briefly. One camera positioned along a game trail captured the clearest footage we obtained. The Dogman walked past the camera at a distance of approximately 30 feet. The creature was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its gait was smooth and efficient, showing none of the awkwardness that might be expected from a bipedal canine. The footage lasted only 6 seconds before the Dogman moved out of frame, but those 6 seconds provided more detail than months of other observations. We noticed something interesting about the camera footage. The Dogman creatures seemed to know where cameras were positioned and adjusted their behavior accordingly. They would approach cameras from angles that minimized clear visibility. They would move past quickly rather than lingering. On several occasions we found cameras that had been moved slightly, tilted just enough to aim at blank forest rather than active trails. The Dogman pair was aware of our surveillance and responding to it. Audio recorders picked up vocalizations unlike any documented predator. Deep howls that carried for miles, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication rather than simple territorial calls. The sounds occurred most frequently during new moon periods when darkness was deepest. We recorded instances where howls from different locations responded to each other in what seemed like coordinated exchanges. The Dogman creatures were communicating across distances. We analyzed the vocalizations using audio spectrum software. The howls showed complexity that exceeded wolf or coyote calls. Multiple frequency bands suggested vocal structures capable of producing varied sounds. Some calls contained what appeared to be patterned elements that repeated across different recordings, hinting at possible language structure. While we could not decode meaning, the consistent patterns indicated these were not random vocalizations, but purposeful communications. One particularly interesting recording captured what sounded like a coordinated hunt in progress. We had positioned microphones near a deer trail known to be active. Shortly after midnight, howls began from opposite sides of the trail. They alternated in a pattern that seemed designed to drive prey between the 2 Dogman creatures. The sounds moved closer together over approximately 15 minutes, then ceased abruptly. In the morning, we found evidence of a kill site and drag marks where the prey had been moved elsewhere. 6 months into the investigation, we discovered a cache site. A natural depression beneath an overhanging rock shelf held bones from deer, wild hogs, and larger animals we could not immediately identify. The bones showed evidence of being cracked open for marrow extraction, a behavior associated with higher intelligence predators. The cache was maintained, with fresher remains on top and older bones pushed to the sides. The Dogman pair were storing food and returning to it systematically. The cache site revealed organizational behaviors that went beyond simple food storage. The remains were sorted by type and age. Larger bones were arranged along the back of the depression, where they would stay driest. Smaller bones and fragments were kept near the front for easier access. The arrangement suggested these Dogman creatures understood preservation and planned their resource use. This was not opportunistic scavenging but managed food security. We set up a camera focused on the cache site to document usage patterns. Over 6 weeks, we recorded 11 visits by the Dogman pair. They typically arrived together, spent 10 to 15 minutes at the site, then departed in the same coordinated fashion they used for all movement. On 3 occasions, they brought fresh kills to add to the cache. The systematic nature of their behavior indicated planning capabilities that challenged our assumptions about animal intelligence. The senior ranger found evidence of tool use near the cache site. Rocks positioned to crush bones, branches arranged to create shade over the stored food, and cleared pathways suggesting deliberate landscape modification. These were not random acts but purposeful manipulations of the environment. The Dogman creatures possessed cognitive abilities far beyond typical animal behavior. They were planning ahead, using resources efficiently, and demonstrating abstract thinking. One rock near the cache showed repeated use as an anvil for breaking bones. The impact marks accumulated in a specific spot that optimized leverage and striking angle. This was learned behavior refined through practice. The Dogman creatures had discovered that certain rocks placed at certain angles made bone breaking more efficient. They had retained this knowledge and taught it to each other, demonstrating cultural transmission of learned skills. We decided to attempt nighttime observation. The risks were significant, but aerial surveillance had reached its limits. Understanding Dogman behavior required closer proximity. We chose a location where multiple trails converged near a spring-fed creek. The younger ranger and I would maintain position in an elevated blind, while the senior ranger monitored from a ridge above with thermal imaging equipment. The plan relied on the Dogman creatures following their established patterns. The blind was constructed 2 weeks before our planned observation. We wanted the Dogman creatures to become accustomed to its presence. The structure was simple, built from natural materials that blended with the forest. We positioned it in a large oak tree 15 feet off the ground, high enough to provide visibility but not so exposed that we would be obvious. Access was via climbing rope that we could pull up after ourselves. We equipped the blind with thermal imaging monoculars, night vision equipment, and sound recording devices. The senior ranger positioned himself on a ridge 300 yards away with a thermal scope that could monitor both our location and the approaches to the creek. We established radio communication using earpieces that required only whispered speech. The setup allowed us to observe without giving away our presence through unnecessary movement or noise. We reached the blind 3 hours before sunset and settled in for a long wait. The forest sounds changed as darkness fell. Normal evening activity from birds and small mammals gradually quieted until an unnatural silence settled over the area. The temperature dropped and mist began rising from the creek. My watch showed 10:30 when the first Dogman vocalization echoed through the trees. The sound came from perhaps half a mile east and was answered immediately by another call from the west. The calls had a quality that raised the hair on my neck. They were not the random howls of animals marking territory. These vocalizations carried pattern and structure. The eastern call would sound a rising howl that peaked and fell over approximately 10 seconds. The western call would respond with a similar pattern but slightly different pitch. Then silence for several minutes before the exchange repeated. The Dogman pair were coordinating something. Movement registered on our thermal monitor. A large heat signature appeared at the edge of detection range, moving steadily toward the creek. The shape was distinctly bipedal, tall and broad across the shoulders. A second signature appeared from a different direction, also converging on the water source. The Dogman pair were approaching from opposite sides, demonstrating the same coordinated movement I had observed from the helicopter months earlier. The thermal signatures moved with purpose and precision. They did not wander or investigate randomly. Each dogman followed a direct path toward the creek, pausing occasionally, but never deviating from their general direction. The movement suggested familiarity with the terrain and confidence in their route. These creatures knew exactly where they were going and had traveled these paths many times before. The first dogman emerged from the tree line approximately 80 yards from our position. Even in the darkness, the size was overwhelming. It stood upright at easily 7.5 feet tall, with massive shoulders and a distinctly canine head profile. Dark fur covered its entire body, thicker around the neck and shoulders. The dogman moved to the creek and lowered itself to drink, but its head never stopped scanning the surrounding forest. Through the night vision equipment, I could see details that had been impossible from the helicopter. The dogman face showed clear canine features, with an elongated muzzle and pointed ears that moved independently to track sounds. The eyes reflected light from the moon, showing the typical eye shine of predators, but the posture and body language suggested something beyond animal intelligence. The way it held its head, the deliberate scanning pattern, the controlled movements all spoke to awareness that exceeded instinct. The second dogman appeared moments later from the opposite bank. This one was slightly smaller but moved with equal confidence. They acknowledged each other with low vocalizations that carried clearly across the water. Both dogman creatures then began a systematic patrol of the creek banks, moving in opposite directions while maintaining visual contact. They were not simply drinking, but securing the area with practiced efficiency. I watched them work through the perimeter check. The larger dogman moved along the eastern bank, while the smaller one covered the west. They stopped at regular intervals, sampling the air and examining specific locations. At one point, the larger dogman bent to examine a spot where deer had recently crossed. It spent perhaps 30 seconds investigating the tracks before moving on. The dogman was gathering information about other animals using the area, monitoring its territory with the thoroughness of an intelligent predator. The larger dogman stopped suddenly and raised its head, nostrils flaring. It had caught a scent. For several seconds it remained completely still, processing information. Then it turned and looked directly at our blind. The distance was too great to see details of its face in the darkness, but I felt the weight of its attention. The dogman knew we were there. It had known from the beginning. They both had. My heart hammered against my ribs. The younger ranger beside me had gone completely rigid, barely breathing. We had been so careful about scent control, wind direction, and noise discipline, yet the dogman had detected us anyway. Perhaps it was our body heat creating air currents. Perhaps human scent cannot be completely masked regardless of precautions. Perhaps these creatures possessed sensory capabilities we did not understand. The how did not matter. The important fact was that our cover was compromised. The dogman pair did not flee or attack. Instead, they moved into positions that flanked our location, one upstream and one down. The coordination was deliberate and tactical. They were assessing us as much as we were observing them. Minutes passed in complete stillness. Neither dogman advanced, but neither withdrew. The message was clear. This was their territory, and our presence was tolerated only because they allowed it. I watched through the night vision as they took up their flanking positions. The movements were economical and precise. No wasted motion, no hesitation. They positioned themselves to monitor our blind while maintaining escape routes and visual contact with each other. It was tactical thinking that would not be out of place in a military operation. The dogman creatures were demonstrating situational awareness and strategic planning that exceeded anything I had seen from wild animals. The senior ranger communicated through our radio earpiece that he had clear thermal readings on both dogman creatures plus our position. He advised remaining still and letting them make the next move. The situation felt balanced on a knife edge. Any aggressive action on our part would likely trigger a response we were not equipped to handle. The dogman creatures outweighed us significantly and were operating in terrain they knew intimately. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. During that time, the dogman pair remained in their flanking positions, occasionally shifting weight or adjusting posture, but never breaking their watch on our blind. I could see their breath in the cold air, visible as thermal plumes through the night vision equipment. They were calm and patient, willing to wait us out. The control they demonstrated over their own behavior was remarkable. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 15 minutes, the larger Dogman vocalized again. The sound was different this time, less aggressive and more questioning. The second Dogman responded with a similar tone. They appeared to be communicating about us. Then, with no apparent signal, both Dogman creatures turned and moved back into the forest. Their departure was as coordinated as their arrival. Within seconds, the thermal signatures faded beyond detection range. The vocalizations they exchanged before departing had a quality I had not heard in previous recordings. The tone was measured and deliberate, lacking the territorial aggression of their long-distance howls. They were discussing something, reaching some kind of consensus. I had the distinct impression they had decided we posed no immediate threat and were not worth further attention. The Dogman pair had assessed, categorized, and dismissed us with calculated intelligence. We remained in the blind until dawn despite the Dogman pair leaving the area. The younger ranger was shaking, not from cold, but from the intensity of the encounter. I understood completely. Seeing them from a helicopter was one thing. Being at ground level while they assessed us was something else entirely. The intelligence behind their actions was undeniable. They had allowed us to observe them under controlled circumstances, demonstrating capabilities we could only guess at. As first light filtered through the canopy, we descended from the blind with stiff muscles and exhausted minds. The night had been transformative in ways that would take time to fully process. We had witnessed behavior that challenged every assumption about what these creatures were capable of. The Dogman pair had outmaneuvered us tactically, demonstrated remarkable restraint, and communicated complex thoughts to each other. This was intelligence on a level that demanded respect. The tracks we found at dawn told the story more completely. The Dogman pair had circled our position completely during the night, approaching to within 30 yards before withdrawing. They had moved silently enough that we heard nothing despite being alert. The prints showed they had stopped at multiple points, likely observing us while we believed we were observing them. The power dynamic had never been what we assumed. One set of tracks came close enough to our tree that the Dogman would have been able to see directly into the blind if it had looked up. The prints showed it had stopped and stood motionless for a period, the depth and definition indicating stationary wait. It had watched us from perhaps 20 feet away while we focused our attention on the creek. The realization sent chills through me. At any point during the night, the Dogman could have approached closer or acted aggressively. It had chosen not to. The senior ranger met us at the base of the tree as we packed our equipment. He had monitored the entire encounter from his ridge position. The thermal footage he captured would be the most detailed documentation we had obtained. He described watching the Dogman pair execute what he recognized as a classic reconnaissance pattern, moving in coordinated sweeps to assess the threat level we represented. The behavior was textbook military tactics applied by creatures that should not possess such knowledge. We returned to the area twice more over the following weeks. The Dogman creatures did not reveal themselves again on those occasions, though evidence of their presence remained obvious. Tracks appeared near our vehicles when we hiked in. Vocalizations echoed from ridges as we moved through the territory. The message seemed consistent. We were being monitored and permitted to continue only under terms they set. On one return visit, we found our trail cameras had been deliberately turned to face away from active trails. The cameras were not damaged or disturbed beyond the repositioning. The Dogman creatures had recognized the devices as observation tools and neutralized them without destroying them. This showed not only tool recognition but also restraint, and perhaps even a rudimentary understanding that destroying the cameras might provoke a stronger response from us than simply making them useless. The photographs and documentation we gathered would never satisfy scientific skeptics. No single piece of evidence proved beyond doubt that the Dogman creatures existed, but the accumulation of data built a compelling case. The tracks were real. The vocalizations were recorded. The behavioral patterns showed intelligence and social structure. Something inhabited that Mississippi forest that official biology refused to acknowledge. Research into European werewolf accounts revealed striking parallels to our observations. Medieval descriptions of coordinated pack hunting matched the Dogman pair behavior we documented. Reports of territorial marking and cache sites appeared in records from France and Germany dating back centuries. The mythological transformation element was absent, but the core creature behaviors aligned precisely. The Dogman phenomenon was not isolated to North America. The question of what the Dogman creatures actually are remains unanswered. The evolutionary path that could produce bipedal canines is not documented in paleontology, yet something exists in these forests that defies simple classification. Perhaps they represent a relict population that survived through isolation and adaptation. Perhaps parallel evolution produced similar forms in different regions. The gaps in scientific understanding leave room for possibilities mainstream biology rejects. I continue flying over the territory regularly. The helicopter provides a unique vantage point that reveals patterns ground observers miss. I have spotted the Dogman pair on 3 additional occasions since that first sighting. Each time they are traveling together with the same coordinated movement. They appear healthy and well established in their range. Whatever they are thriving in their hidden world. The rangers maintain their documentation efforts while balancing official duties. We share information through secure channels and coordinate research when possible. Other researchers have contacted us after hearing about our work. Similar encounters have occurred in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The Dogman phenomenon appears more widespread than any of us initially realized. A network of people are quietly investigating without the spotlight that would drive these creatures deeper into hiding. The worst that happened was not physical danger, though that risk was always present. The worst was realizing how much remains unknown about the world we think we understand. The confidence that modern science has documented all significant species crumbles when confronted with evidence that contradicts established knowledge. The Dogman creatures exist in the gaps of our certainty, in the places we stopped looking because we assumed we knew what was there. I have learned to read the signs that indicate Dogman presence. Certain patterns of game movement suggest predators with intelligence. Specific types of tree markings reveal territorial boundaries. Vocal patterns recorded at different locations demonstrate communication networks. The evidence surrounds us if we learn to recognize it. Most people never develop that awareness because they are not looking for what they do not believe exists. The decision to dedicate significant portions of my life to this investigation came from that first sighting. Seeing those 2 Dogman creatures moving through the forest with such obvious purpose and coordination changed my understanding of what is possible. I cannot ignore what I witnessed. I cannot pretend that conventional explanations account for the accumulated evidence. Something lives in these forests that science has not yet acknowledged. The younger ranger eventually transferred to a different district. The intensity of our close encounter affected him more deeply than he admitted at the time. He still maintains interest in the subject but needed distance from active investigation. The senior ranger continues his work with the same methodical approach that has defined his career. Some people are built to pursue uncomfortable truths. Others need to step back for their own well-being. Both responses are valid. Local residents who live near the Dogman territory often have stories they share cautiously. Strange sounds at night, livestock killed in unusual ways, glimpses of something large moving through the woods. They do not report these incidents officially because they know the response will be dismissive. But in private conversations away from judgment, the accounts emerge. The Dogman presence affects the community whether acknowledged or not. The behavioral intelligence demonstrated by the Dogman pair raises profound questions about consciousness and cognition. If these creatures possess planning abilities, coordinated communication, and situational awareness comparable to humans, what does that mean for our understanding of intelligence evolution? The implications extend beyond cryptozoology into neuroscience and evolutionary biology. But those discussions cannot happen without acceptance that the creatures exist. I have considered what would happen if definitive proof emerged. Would it benefit the Dogman creatures or endanger them? The immediate response would likely be sensational media coverage, followed by invasive research efforts and trophy hunters. The remote territory that currently protects them would become a destination. Perhaps the lack of absolute proof serves them better than validation would. Perhaps they have survived this long precisely because most people dismiss the possibility of their existence. The European werewolf trials of the 16th and 17th centuries took on new context through our research. Many accused individuals likely encountered actual Dogman creatures and interpreted them through the cultural lens available at the time. The idea of shape-shifting humans explained observations that did not fit known animals. Modern cryptozoology provides different frameworks, but the underlying reality may be the same phenomenon separated by centuries. Documentation continues with new technology as it becomes available. Better cameras, more sensitive audio equipment, improved thermal imaging all contribute to building the evidence base. Each piece of data adds to the larger picture even when individual items prove inconclusive. The cumulative weight of properly gathered evidence eventually becomes impossible to ignore. We are creating that accumulation methodically and patiently. The Mississippi forest where the Dogman pair maintain their territory spans thousands of acres of protected land. Public access is limited and commercial development restricted. These conditions create an environment where large predators can exist without constant human interference. Similar habitat exists throughout North America in regions that coincide with Dogman sighting clusters. Correlation suggests these creatures require space and isolation to survive. I have flown over countless miles of wilderness in search of additional sightings. The original encounter remains the clearest observation I have made. Subsequent sightings have been briefer and less detailed. The Dogman creatures appear to have adapted their behavior in response to aerial observation, staying under heavy canopy during daylight hours. Their intelligence includes learning from exposure and adjusting tactics accordingly. The night observation experience taught me respect for capabilities I had underestimated. Being watched while believing you are the observer reverses the power dynamic completely. The Dogman pair controlled that entire encounter from beginning to end. They chose when to reveal themselves, how close to approach, and when to withdraw. We were never in charge despite our technology and planning. That humility remains with me. Other pilots have reported similar sightings after hearing about my experience. A helicopter pilot in Michigan described observing 3 Dogman creatures moving through a swamp at dawn. A bush pilot in Alaska mentioned seeing large bipedal figures near a remote lake. The reports share common elements despite coming from different regions and observers with no connection to each other. The pattern suggests these creatures have a wider distribution than documented sightings indicate. The senior ranger compiled historical records of unexplained livestock deaths dating back over a century in the region. When mapped, the locations cluster around the same core territory we identified through current research. The Dogman presence has been consistent across generations. Local folklore dismissed as superstition likely reflects genuine encounters passed down through families who learned to avoid certain areas without understanding why. Physical evidence remains frustratingly limited despite extensive fieldwork. The Dogman creatures are careful about what they leave behind. Tracks wash away in rain. Scat samples prove difficult to distinguish from other large predators. Without DNA analysis, we cannot access through official channels. Hair samples caught on bark have yielded inconclusive results. The creatures seem to understand evidence and minimize their traces deliberately. I have presented sanitized versions of our findings to small groups of interested researchers. The response divides predictably between those who dismiss everything as misidentification and those who have had similar experiences. No middle ground exists. Either you believe eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence suggests something unknown, or you reject the possibility entirely. Scientific method struggles with phenomena that cannot be reproduced under controlled conditions. The coordination between the 2 Dogman creatures remains the most compelling aspect of their behavior. Pack hunting exists throughout nature, but the level of tactical awareness they demonstrated exceeds normal animal coordination. They planned movements, communicated intentions, and adapted strategies in real time. That requires cognitive abilities associated with higher-order thinking. These are not simply large predators operating on instinct. Years have passed. since that initial sighting changed my life trajectory. The investigation continues with the same methodical approach, despite limited progress toward definitive proof. Some questions may not have answers that satisfy everyone. Some mysteries persist because they serve purposes we do not fully understand. The Dogman creatures remain in the forests, living their lives largely undocumented by official science. I still fly the same routes over the same territories. The helicopter remains the best tool for covering large areas and spotting movement that ground observers miss. Each flight carries the possibility of another clear sighting that might provide the documentation needed to advance understanding. Until then, the work continues in increments, building evidence patiently while respecting the creatures we seek to understand. The worst that happened was not danger or fear, though both were present. The worst was the isolation that comes from knowing something that most people refuse to consider possible. You cannot share the experience fully with those who have not witnessed similar phenomena. The divide between experiencers and skeptics is unbridgeable through words alone. Some knowledge can only come through direct encounter. The Mississippi forest keeps its secrets well. The Dogman pair continue their existence in the spaces between human awareness and official recognition. They hunt, communicate, and maintain their territory as they likely have for generations. Our brief intersections with their world provided glimpses of something remarkable that defies easy explanation. Those glimpses must be enough because forcing more would betray the respect their intelligence deserves. For anyone who has had similar experiences, know that you are not alone. The Dogman phenomenon is real in ways that matter, regardless of official acceptance. Trust what you observed. Document what you can. Respect the creatures and the mysteries they represent. The world contains more than our current understanding acknowledges. That is not a failure of science, but a reminder that discovery remains possible if we stay open to evidence that challenges our assumptions. I will continue this work for as long as I can fly. The helicopter provides access to wilderness that remains largely unexplored from the air. The possibility of another clear sighting drives continued effort. But even without additional breakthroughs, the experience of that first observation and the investigation it inspired have given my life purpose beyond routine work. Some callings find you when you least expect them. The two Dogman creatures I spotted over Mississippi forest that October morning remain out there. The evidence suggests they thrive in their hidden territory. Whatever worst happened was not to them, but to my assumptions about what is possible in the natural world. Those assumptions dissolved in the face of direct observation. What replaced them is a commitment to pursuing truth, even when that pursuit leads to uncomfortable places outside conventional wisdom. For more stories like this, make sure you subscribe. The investigation continues, and new evidence emerges regularly. Understanding comes slowly, but it comes. The Dogman creatures exist whether science acknowledges them or not. Our task is not to prove they exist to skeptics, but to document their behavior and nature for those willing to consider possibilities beyond current biological frameworks. That work matters regardless of broader acceptance.